The evening air carried the warmth of spring as I parked at the edge of the long circular driveway leading up to my parents' home in Houston. The lawn was trimmed to perfection. Lights strung across the entryway shimmered in anticipation of Easter Sunday dinner. I had chosen my dress carefully, navy blue, understated, respectable, because in this family, appearances had always been the silent currency. In my hands, I carried a cake from a little French bakery in Montrose, the kind my mother once said she liked, though she rarely acknowledged it when I tried to please her. I stepped inside, greeted not by a welcome but by a wave of noise, laughter, glasses clinking, the low hum of conversations about real estate and markets. The smell of roasted lamb and potatoes hit me, rich and comforting, but it also carried a weight, memories of family gatherings where my presence was tolerated but never celebrated. I paused in the doorway, scanning the dining hall. The grand table stretched long, candles flickering, relatives already seated in neat rows. At the center, of course, sat my parents, Ottilie and Blythe, with my sister Serafina by their side. I looked for my name card, heart sinking when I saw it tucked far at the end, near the hallway to the restroom. Half hidden behind a decorative plant, my chair seemed placed deliberately away from the glow of the family circle. Family is supposed to be your compass, I muttered under my breath, setting the cake down on the sideboard. But I already feel off course. I smoothed my dress, lifted my chin, and walked toward my lonely seat. From my place at the far edge, I watched the flow of greetings. Cousins from Dallas arrived, greeted with wide arms and long embraces. Uncles slapped nephews on the back, their laughter echoing like old fraternity brothers. When I finally crossed the room, my mother barely looked up. "Oh, you're here," she said, eyes already darting back to the cousin she had been speaking with. "Put that cake on the counter." I did as she asked, forcing a smile though no one noticed. Serafina's laugh rang out across the table. She was surrounded, soaking in compliments about her dedication to the company. I heard my aunt say, "She really has the head for business, just like your father." I bit the inside of my cheek. Sliding into my chair by the restroom, I tried to ignore how symbolic it felt. The placement screamed what I already knew, out of sight, out of mind. Dinner began. Platters of food passed around like currency of approval. Conversation flowed easily at the center of the table. "The market's been strong," my uncle declared. "I just closed on a second home in Galveston." Someone else chimed in about their portfolio, another about their children's private schools. I tried to join in once, commenting softly about the small grant program I'd helped secure for local pet shelters. Silence followed, then forks clattered back into motion as if I hadn't spoken. My words evaporated before they reached anyone. My plate was full, but my appetite wasn't. Wine glasses clinked, toasts made for cousins' promotions, Serafina's efficiency, even a neighbor's small achievement. None were raised for me. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, rehearsing invisible comebacks that never left my mouth. You can be in the room and still feel completely alone, I thought, forcing down a bite of lamb that tasted like sawdust. Then my father stood. His presence commanded silence, and within seconds, the room obeyed. Blythe lifted his glass high, his booming voice carrying across the table. "Our family," he declared, "has always been built on strength and legacy. Tonight, I'm proud to say that this legacy is in capable hands. From this day forward, the future of Walker Co. belongs to Serafina." Applause thundered immediately, rehearsed and eager. I swallowed hard, heart thudding as I clapped weakly, feeling the sting of exclusion tighten around my chest. "And unlike her sister," my father continued, his voice dropping into a tone of mockery, "who wastes her time in that useless, dirty little career, Serafina understands what it means to honor her family." Laughter rippled across the room, some nervous, some genuine. I felt my cheeks burn. My fork trembled in my hand under the table, the metal cold against my palm. I willed myself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. Serafina basked in the applause, smiling graciously as if she hadn't stolen every ounce of recognition that should have been shared. My mother's eyes glowed with pride. My father's words hung in the air like a verdict, final and cruel. I glanced back at my chair, the one shoved against the restroom hallway, the one nobody wanted to sit in. People passed by me constantly, Servers carrying trays, guests excusing themselves to use the bathroom. I was literally placed where the traffic flowed, like an afterthought, like a guest at my own table. My mother avoided my gaze. My father continued to toast, his arm draped proudly around Serafina's shoulders. In that moment, it struck me. They hadn't just forgotten me, they had written me out. I whispered inside, steady but sharp. Maybe I was never meant to sit at this table. That night, humiliation tasted sharper than the wine in my glass, and I knew this wasn't something I could swallow quietly again. After my father's cruel toast, I sat frozen in my chair, the laughter still echoing down the long table. I told myself to breathe, to keep my head upright, to let the sting fade. Around me, plates shifted, wine refilled, and chatter rose again as if nothing had happened. I folded my napkin carefully on my lap, reminding myself that even if I was invisible, small gestures might still count. I thought about the cake resting on the counter, a cake I had driven across town to buy from a bakery in Austin because my mother once said she liked their mousse. Maybe that single act of thoughtfulness could soften something in her tonight. I kept glancing at it, hoping someone would notice and bring it forward. Serafina's voice carried over the hum of conversation, bright and effortless. She was glowing under the light, laughing with a cousin who leaned close to hang on her every word. My seat by the restroom door felt more absurd with every passing moment. Yet I clung to the thought, sometimes love shows up in small gestures. Maybe, just maybe, they would see mine. It happened quickly, almost casually. My mother finally noticed the cake, but not because of me. Serafina walked to the counter, lifted the box, and set it down in front of everyone. "Oh, Serafina," my mother exclaimed, her voice louder than it had been all night. "You always think of me. You're so thoughtful." Applause broke out around the table. Relatives nodded, smiling, even clapping for her. I stared at the cake, my hands gripping the table edge so hard my nails dug into the wood. I opened my mouth, ready to correct the mistake, but the chorus of approval drowned me out. "That's why she's the future of this family," my father added, raising his glass once more. The cheer returned, louder than before. My stomach twisted. The cake, my gesture, my effort, gone. Credit neatly folded into Serafina's image of perfection. I sat still, the heat rising into my cheeks, forcing myself not to speak. Across from me, an uncle leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She's really remarkable, isn't she? Always going the extra mile." I caught Serafina's eye. She held my gaze for a brief second, then smiled smugly, as if she knew exactly what she had done. Sometimes silence screams louder than words, I thought, swallowing down the protest that burned in my throat. As dessert plates were cleared, waiters distributed glossy brochures across the table. The cover bore the bold title, "The Future of Walker Co." My father's pride was practically audible as the booklets were passed out like trophies. I opened mine carefully, my eyes scanning quickly for my name. At first I didn't see it. Page after page showed Serafina's face, posed with executives smiling in tailored suits, photographed in the gleaming offices of the company. The caption read, "Next CEO." Finally, on the last page, in the staff section, I found it. My name, Dimity Walker, listed beneath a heading marked, "Assistants." My chest tightened, the air heavy in my lungs. I had never been hired by the company, never paid by it, but somehow they had found a place for me at the very bottom. My cousin sitting next to me leaned over, chuckling uncomfortably. "At least they spelled your name right," he murmured, flipping his own copy closed. I stared at the page, unable to move. It felt like reading my own obituary, like watching history being rewritten while I was still alive. My family had managed to reduce me to a footnote. I whispered under my breath, low enough that only I could hear. They rewrote history and left me a footnote. The voices around me swirled, relatives commenting on Serafina's leadership, her intelligence, her sacrifices. Each word pushed me further into a hollow space, detached from the clinking glasses and polite laughter. I excused myself quietly, pushing my chair back and walking toward the hallway that led to the restroom. The mirror above the sink reflected a face I almost didn't recognize, Tired eyes, jaw tight, lips pressed together to hold back the storm. I can't let them define me like this, I whispered to my reflection. Not anymore. Images flooded my mind. Birthdays where my gifts were brushed aside, holidays where Serafina's accomplishments were paraded while mine were ignored, years of small humiliations I told myself to forgive. It was no longer possible to see these as oversights. This was deliberate, intentional, a pattern designed to erase me. I leaned against the counter, staring harder at my reflection. I looked weary, but behind the exhaustion, a quiet fire burned. I thought of a quote I once read. "The best revenge is massive success." Sinatra's words echoed in the bathroom's silence. For the first time that evening, my lips curved into something close to a smile, not of joy, but of resolve. When I returned to the table, the banquet looked different. It wasn't brighter or louder. It was simply clearer. To them, I wasn't part of the family. They had already erased me, already built a future that didn't include my name. I sat back in my seat, hands resting calmly on the table, my heartbeat steady. They believed I was invisible, expendable, someone to push to the edge of the room and the margins of their story. But something inside me shifted. Anger had always been there, but now it had direction, a shape, a purpose. They thought they had written me out, I said to myself silently, looking down the long stretch of the table to where Serafina sat, basking in praise. They didn't realize I was just beginning to write my own story. The memory still comes to me in fragments. The smell of old cigar smoke, the weight of silence inside my father's office, and the sight of polished mahogany that had always symbolized permanence. It was a year before the banquet, but the sting of that day carried into everything that came after. I walked in expecting to witness my place secured, my name inked on the documents that were supposed to carry our legacy forward. Instead, I saw papers spread across the desk, shareholder certificates stacked neatly, and my father seated with Serafina at his side like a king grooming his heir. My eyes scanned the list, searching for my name. There should have been 2 daughters side by side. But where I expected recognition, I found a blank. My name wasn't missing by mistake, it was absent by design. "Dad?" I asked carefully, though my chest felt tight. "Why isn't my name here? You told me—" He didn't even glance up. His voice came sharp, cold. "This company needs clarity." "We don't have room for confusion. You chose a dirty career, Dimity. We chose the heir." The words dropped heavy, final. Serafina leaned back, smirk tugging at her lips, her fingers flipping the page as though she had already claimed it all. The rage inside me begged for release. I wanted to slam my hand on the desk, to demand he explain how decades of being his daughter could be wiped away so easily, but no sound came out. My throat locked, as if even my voice had been erased along with my name. My mother entered then, a tray of tea in her hands. She set it down with grace, glanced at me once and said, "Don't make a scene, Dimity. This is how things must be." That was her comfort. This is how things must be. I stood frozen, the papers shaking slightly in my hand. There was no fight I could start that would change their decision. They had closed ranks around Serafina, and my existence inside that office was already a nuisance. I left without speaking, my fists clenched so tight they ached. In my head, I repeated a phrase I'd once read. Sometimes silence isn't consent, it's survival. That day, silence was all I had. But survival, I promised myself, would mean remembering every detail, every word. Months later, the phone rang close to midnight. I recognized the number instantly. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Dimity," my father said, his voice stripped of authority, heavy with something I hadn't heard before, desperation. "What is it?" I asked, sitting upright on the edge of my bed. "There's been a problem. A contract fell through. We need money immediately, or the company will suffer irreparable damage. You understand what that means." I hesitated. The image of that office resurfaced, my name erased, his declaration that I was unworthy. But the word family echoed louder than memory. "How much?" I asked, though every nerve in my body screamed not to. 50,000, he said. Just to cover until things stabilize. You'll have it back. You know we always take care of our own. I laughed bitterly under my breath. Do you? Don't be ungrateful now, he snapped, the desperation cracking but the arrogance still intact. You have the means. This is for your family's survival. The silence stretched long. My pulse hammered as I stared at the credit card on my nightstand, knowing what this choice would cost me. Finally, I said quietly, "Fine." The next day, I wired the money, maxing out my card, pulling from savings that had taken years of late nights and hard work to build. I whispered to myself, maybe this will make them see me differently. Maybe this will be enough. But it wasn't. At the next family gathering, my father stood once more, pride swelling his voice. "Let us thank Serafina," he announced, "for her quick action in saving us when disaster struck. She is the reason this company still stands." Applause burst across the table. Relatives clapped, nodding approvingly, voices layering with admiration. I froze, fork poised in midair. $50,000 had left my account, sacrificed in silence, yet credit had already been redirected, absorbed into Serafina's crown. She smiled, modest but triumphant, as if she had indeed rescued them. My mother touched her arm tenderly and whispered, "This is why you're meant to lead." Not once did anyone glance my way. I realized then I had been erased twice, once from the books, once from their gratitude. That night, lying awake in my small apartment, I replayed the two moments like a cruel film loop. The blank space where my name should have been, the applause for Serafina bought with my sacrifice. My chest burned with humiliation and anger, but beneath it all was clarity. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was who they were. "They only see me when they need me," I whispered into the dark. "Never when I give." I remembered another saying, "Family isn't blood, it's loyalty." And loyalty, I realized, was something they had never given me. That night, I made a vow, not to them, but to myself. If they could erase me, then I could erase my need for them. Later, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection. The same weary eyes, the same tired lines. But now there was something else. My fists trembled at my sides, not from fear, but from resolve. "They think I'm weak because I stayed silent," I whispered, my voice low but steady. "They'll see what silence can build." The banquet wasn't the first betrayal. It was simply the one I refused to swallow. Weeks after the banquet, I was still replaying my father's words in my head when my phone rang late at night. The number flashing on the screen made my chest tighten. It was him. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, but habit, loyalty mixed with dread, made me swipe to answer. "Dimity," he said, his voice stripped of its usual force. It was unsteady, almost pleading. "We're in trouble again. The company, contracts fell apart, and if word gets out, the Walker name will be dragged through the mud." I didn't speak right away. I thought of the humiliation at the banquet, my erased name in the brochures, the stolen cake. Every humiliation weighed on my tongue. "Why are you calling me?" I asked finally. "Because you understand duty," he said. "Think of the Walker name. We can't afford shame. Just help us bridge this once more." The silence stretched. I should have hung up. Instead, I felt that old reflex, family obligation, dragging me back in. My anger screamed no, but the word family lingered. "You've mistaken me for someone who still believes," I whispered. But what I said next betrayed me. "How much?" The next evening, he came in person. My father sat across from me in my small living room, explaining debts, unpaid suppliers, the company on the verge of collapse. He painted it as temporary, just a bridge loan. "Just this once," he insisted, his eyes fixed on me. "Help us, and we'll never forget." "Why me?" I asked, folding my arms. "You have Serafina. Isn't she your savior?" The silence that followed was an answer. His gaze hardened. "Because you have savings, and she is already carrying the weight." I laughed under my breath, sharp and bitter. "Carrying the weight? Do you even hear yourself?" Don't be difficult, he snapped. This is not the time. I stared at him, fury churning, but underneath it, an ember of hope still flickered. Maybe if I gave again, they would finally see me differently. Against my better judgment, I said quietly, "Fine." The next morning, I wired the money, draining the account I had fought years to build. My hands trembled as I typed the transfer, whispering, "Maybe this time they'll see me." Days later, another family gathering. I arrived late, stomach tight, wondering if anyone would acknowledge the sacrifice I had just made. As I took my seat near the back, I watched my father rise with his glass again. "I want to thank Serafina," he announced, his voice filled with pride. Her devotion saved the company once more. Applause broke out, cousins clapping, relatives nodding in admiration. My mother smiled and added, "She's such a responsible young woman, truly a leader." Not a word about me, not a glance in my direction. The money I had drained from my account had already vanished into Serafina's reputation. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I forced my lips into a tight line, silent. Credit is free when you steal it from the silent, I thought, my jaw clenched. Across the table, Serafina accepted the praise with a gracious smile, eyes meeting mine for a fleeting second. She knew. She always knew. And she enjoyed it. I sat still as relatives patted her back, congratulated my parents, and passed the wine. Invisible, again. When the evening ended, I caught my father in the hallway. The others had left the room, laughter fading down the stairs. I stepped in front of him, forcing him to look at me. "This is the last time," I whispered. "Don't mistake my silence for acceptance." He smirked, dismissive, the same way he always did when he thought he'd won. "You'll always come back, Dimity. That's what family does." My chest burned, but my voice stayed calm. "Not forever." He chuckled lightly, shaking his head as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. But I had given my warning, even if he didn't hear it. That night, I sat in front of my computer, staring at the drained balance on my bank account. The numbers glared back at me, cold and merciless. In my mind, I saw again the smirk etched on my father's face. "They've mistaken my patience for weakness," I whispered into the quiet of my apartment. "One day, that mistake will cost them everything." I had warned them. But warnings mean nothing to those who never listen. A few weeks after I had wired the money, an invitation came for another family dinner. My stomach knotted when I read it, but I told myself I would go. Part of me still wanted, despite everything, to be seen, to be acknowledged, maybe even thanked. Foolish, perhaps, but the ember of hope hadn't fully died. The house glowed with warm lights when I arrived, laughter spilling out the windows before I even rang the bell. Inside, the table stretched long again, candles flickering, silverware polished to perfection. My mother greeted me with a brief nod, barely a smile, and guided me toward my seat, again placed far from the center, tucked away at the edge. I tried to swallow my disappointment as I sat down. Around me, conversations already circled Serafina. My father leaned proudly toward a guest, praising her judgment, her sacrifices for the company. The words pricked me like small thorns, steady and sharp. I reached for the breadbasket, forcing myself to chew calmly, though the taste turned to ash in my mouth. I knew better than to expect recognition, but still, that tiny sliver of hope gnawed at me. Throughout the dinner, the comments kept coming, subtle but heavy as stones. "She's the responsible one," my uncle declared, lifting his glass toward Serafina, "always stepping up for the family." "Yes," my aunt chimed in. "I don't know what they'd do without her." My mother nodded along, her smile wide and proud, while her eyes never strayed toward me. I clenched my jaw, my nails biting into my palm under the table. Every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had given, had been swallowed whole and buried under silence. I felt like an outsider in my own bloodline, sitting in a house I had grown up in, listening to a narrative rewritten without me. "Respect isn't given, it's stolen if you're too quiet," I thought bitterly, watching my sister tilt her head modestly, soaking in their applause. I pushed food around my plate, appetite gone. My silence was heavy, but my pride kept me from breaking it too soon. Eventually, the weight of their praise pressed too hard against my ribs. I cleared my throat, speaking softly but firmly. I helped too, you know. It wasn't only Serafina. The room fell still for a heartbeat. My father's head turned sharply toward me, his face hardened, his eyes narrowing. You, he barked, his voice slicing the air. You pick up after animals. That's not a career, Dimity. That's garbage. The words dropped like stones into the silence. Forks froze mid-air. Chairs creaked as relatives shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet mine. Others smirked faintly, enjoying the spectacle. Across the table, Serafina smirked openly, lips curved in satisfaction. My father leaned back, his tone booming with authority. If you had followed our path, the company would be yours. Instead, you chose filth. Don't dare to compare yourself with Serafina. The humiliation stung like fire crawling up my throat. My chest tightened, my hands trembled against the table, but the trembling wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. I took a slow breath, forcing my body still. My voice came out calm, steel hidden in its edges. If my work is garbage, I said, my eyes locked on my father, then garbage saved you when you were drowning in debt. A murmur rippled down the table. My father's face darkened, but I didn't stop. You never asked how I built my career. You never cared that I never took a dime from you. I earned everything I have, alone. And yet, you owe me more than you'll admit. The room was thick with silence. Only Serafina's scoff broke it, sharp and dismissive. You sound bitter, she said coolly. Maybe you should be grateful Dad still lets you sit at this table. I turned to her, my voice steady. Gratitude is earned, not demanded. And if truth sounds bitter to you, maybe it's because it cuts too close. The air bristled with tension. My father's hand slammed against the table, glasses rattling. Enough! You dare lecture me in my own house? I leaned forward, my tone unwavering. The truth doesn't need volume, it needs courage, and I won't swallow it anymore. The silence afterward was deafening, heavy with consequences no one dared to name. I stood, pushing my chair back. My chest rose and fell quickly, but my head was high. I turned toward the door, steps deliberate. Behind me, my father's voice rang out, shrill with rage. Walk away if you dare, Dimity. You'll regret it. I didn't turn back. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing hesitation. As I crossed the threshold, I realized something sharp and certain. Regret was already theirs. They just didn't know it yet. Weeks after that disastrous dinner where my father had called my work garbage, I received an email from him. The subject line glowed on my screen in bold. Your place in the family is secured. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The words inside promised that once the next deal closed, I would be given my rightful share, that my sacrifices and loyalty hadn't gone unnoticed. I read it twice, printed it out, and even set the paper carefully on my desk. For years I had lived on crumbs, small gestures, empty words, the occasional glance that hinted at hope. This felt different. This was written proof, tangible acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, my father still saw me. But a month later, when I returned to the shared family account where that email had been stored, it was gone, deleted, erased as though it had never existed. I confronted him over the phone, the printed copy in my hand. Dad, I have the message. You wrote it. He laughed softly, dismissive. You must have imagined things, Dimity. Don't confuse wishful thinking with reality. The sting of betrayal burned deeper than before. I felt gaslit, my reality dismissed as delusion. That paper in my hand was proof, yet somehow he had twisted it into another reason to doubt myself. That night, I sat at my desk staring at the printed email. The page looked so small, so powerless against the years of denial I had endured. For so long, I had convinced myself to endure, to wait, to believe that eventually my family would see me for who I was. But as I held that paper, I realized even proof could be erased, even words could be denied. They'll never give me what I deserve, I whispered into the quiet room. Not a cent, not respect, nothing. The thought wasn't bitter, it was final. That was the moment I stopped waiting. Early in 2019, I packed what little I had into my car and drove to Austin. My savings were modest, barely enough for rent and a little leftover, but I needed distance. The house I left behind in Houston felt like a mausoleum of broken promises. In Austin, I found a garage for rent, a small, cheap space with a concrete floor and a single buzzing light bulb. To anyone else, it looked like a storage unit. To me, it was freedom, a place where no one could erase me. Neighbors passed by, shaking their heads when they saw me working late into the night. "Starting a business here? Good luck with that," one muttered. I smiled faintly, refusing to let their skepticism cut me the way my family's had. I wasn't alone. Ino, my closest friend, joined me. She didn't flinch at the rough conditions or the lack of resources. Together, we pieced together prototypes using old laptops, secondhand servers, and free software. The garage smelled constantly of burnt coffee and soldering metal, the air heavy with exhaustion and stubborn determination. One evening, as we taped sketches of our product across the wall, Ino looked at me. "You know they'll never believe until they see it succeed." I met her gaze and replied, "They don't have to believe, they just have to watch." Theodore Roosevelt's words often echoed in my mind. Do what you can, with what you have, where you are. That garage embodied it. We had little, but we had enough to start. Many nights, long after Ino had gone home, I stayed behind in the garage alone. I would sit at the folding table, surrounded by wires and empty coffee cups, staring at the sketches taped to the wall. One night, I whispered to the silence, "One day, this garage will be worth more than their empire." It wasn't arrogance that fueled me, it was survival. For the first time in my life, I felt a shift. I was no longer the invisible daughter fighting for a seat at their table. I was a fighter building a new one. The loneliness of that garage was lighter than the suffocating silence of my parents' home. Close to midnight, the hum of the single bulb filled the space as I closed my laptop. My phone buzzed on the table, another family group message lighting up the screen with Serafina's praises. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I leaned back, a faint smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in months, it wasn't forced. "They thought I was gone, forgotten," I whispered. "They didn't see the storm I was building." The first months in Austin were a blur of long nights, empty takeout boxes, and the stubborn hum of my old laptop. I tried to remind myself why I left Houston, why I had chosen distance over suffocation. In that small garage, the air smelled of dust and burnt coffee, but it was mine. Here, I was no one's afterthought. Yet, I knew survival required more than determination. I needed funding. So one morning, I ironed my blouse, gathered my business plan binder, and walked into a local bank. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched the binder, graphs and projections carefully arranged. I told myself over and over, "This is your chance. This is where you'll prove them wrong." Inside, the banker looked me over, his smirk thin but sharp. He flipped the cover of my binder and didn't even try to hide his skepticism. "Aren't you from the Walker family?" he asked. His voice carried a mocking tone that twisted my stomach. "Didn't they cut you off?" My breath caught. It felt as if my family's dismissal had followed me, a shadow I couldn't shake. "I'm here to talk about my company," I replied, forcing my tone steady. He skimmed the pages with the kind of detachment reserved for someone already making a decision. "Ambitious idea, but without backing, without a track record, it's risky." His smile widened, polite but cutting. "We'll have to decline." I gathered the papers, my cheeks burning. Still, I straightened my shoulders, refusing to let him see me collapse. As I walked out into the Texas heat, I whispered to myself, "Every no brings you closer to a yes." That evening, drained but restless, I scrolled through Facebook. And there it was, a post from a distant relative. "She's playing entrepreneur," it read. "Let's see how long until she comes crawling back." Dozens of comments piled beneath it, some couched as jokes, others dripping with scorn. Family members had clicked like. Their words blurred together into one long sneer. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to lash out, but I stopped. Instead, I screenshotted every word. Silence, I decided, could be my sharpest weapon. Ino, sitting beside me, glanced over my shoulder. Her face darkened as she read, "You don't deserve this. she said, her voice low with anger. But keep the receipts. One day they'll matter. I closed the laptop slowly. I don't need to answer them, I said. They've already written their part of the story. Mine is just beginning. Inside, I felt rage coil tight, but beneath it, a strange kind of fuel. Their mockery wasn't crushing me, it was feeding me. Later that night, I stood in the garage again, staring at our crude prototype, wires tangled, servers duct-taped, screens glitching. It looked fragile, imperfect, but it was ours. I ran my hand over the paper sketches taped to the wall, my chest steadying with every touch. They can mock me all they want, I murmured. They don't see what I see. Anew returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting one down beside me. Dimity, she said, her eyes fierce. They laugh now, but you'll laugh last. We worked into the small hours, fueled by caffeine and grit. Every keystroke, every adjustment to the design felt like a step away from their narrative. There were no toasts, no applause, but here, in the hum of the garage, I found belonging. Success is the best revenge, I told Anew, as we collapsed into old folding chairs for a break. She grinned. Then let's make sure it's loud. When I finally shut down for the night, I couldn't shake the images replaying in my head. The banker's smirk, the Facebook post, the cousins clicking like on words meant to humiliate me. Instead of crushing me, the memory sharpened me. Standing in the dim light of the garage, I whispered into the silence, if they see me as a joke, then my success will be the punchline. I didn't want recognition anymore. I wanted proof, undeniable, public, impossible to erase. The seed of vengeance through achievement had taken root. As I turned off the lights, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Not because the path ahead was easy, but because it was finally mine. They thought their laughter was the end of my story. But I knew, deep in my bones, it was only the beginning of theirs. It was one of those nights where fatigue felt like a second skin. The garage was stifling with the scent of solder, half-empty coffee cups littered the folding table, and my eyelids weighed heavier than my ambition. Yet something inside me refused to stop. I stared at the crude prototype on my laptop screen, lines of code, clumsy at best, but alive. Dimity, you should rest, Anew said, stretching as she leaned back in her chair. We've been at it 14 hours straight. I shook my head, gripping my phone. No. If we stop now, it'll feel like all the laughter they threw at me was justified. I need something. That was when the idea came. Not polished pitches, not thick business binders, but something raw. A short video. Just me, explaining why we built this app, why pet owners mattered, why even people who were dismissed as garbage could build something meaningful. I propped up my phone on a stack of boxes. The light was poor, shadows cutting across my face, and the audio crackled with static. Still, I spoke like I was speaking to a friend. Hi, I'm Dimity, I said into the lens, voice trembling but steadying with each word. I know what it feels like to love a pet and feel like nobody's listening. That's why we're building this, so you'll never feel alone in caring for them. I ended it simply, no frills, no fake polish. When it finished uploading to YouTube and Facebook, I leaned back, exhaling. If 10 people watch, I whispered to Anew with a faint smile, I'll call it a win. 2 days later, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Notifications piled in so fast I couldn't read them all. Tens of thousands of views had become hundreds of thousands, then millions. Comments poured in from strangers across the country. Finally, one wrote, someone gets what pet owners need. This is brilliant, another said. Where can I sign up? A headline appeared in a local paper. Austin startup video goes viral. News anchors picked up the story, their voices filled with curiosity about the woman in a garage with a vision. Anew burst through the garage door, her phone in hand, tears glistening in her eyes as she laughed. Dimity, you've started a movement! I sat frozen, my hands trembling as I refreshed the page again and again, watching numbers climb as if gravity had been reversed. Maybe this is it, I whispered, barely audible over the chaos of pings and rings. Maybe this is the turning point. It felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. The viral wave didn't fade, it built momentum. Suddenly, investors were calling. What had started as curious emails became serious offers. Small seed funding turned into introductions to larger firms. I found myself in meetings where the same kind of men who had once dismissed me now leaned forward eagerly, hanging on every word. The garage grew too small for what we were building. We moved into a modest office, then another, until multiple spaces across Austin carried our name. Hiring staff felt surreal, people who didn't know me as the forgotten Walker daughter, but as the founder who gave them a chance. I remember standing in the new office lobby the day we put up our logo. Employees gathered around, clapping, while Ino squeezed my hand. "This," she said, "is what loyalty looks like." Industry mentors reminded me over coffee, "Don't flaunt your success too early. Even family can turn envious." I smiled faintly at that. Family had always been envious, but not of success. They were envious of control. By 2021, our company reached a valuation of $1.2 billion, an official unicorn. I sat in my office, staring at the email from Forbes. "Congratulations, you've been selected for 30 under 30. The magazine arrived weeks later, my face on the glossy page alongside innovators I had admired for years. Friends sent flowers, employees brought champagne, and the office erupted in celebration. I lifted my glass, not to boast, but to honor the nights of exhaustion, the humiliation that had fueled me, the refusal to stay erased. Meanwhile, silence from Houston. No call, no message. Not even acknowledgement that the invisible daughter had built something bigger than their entire empire. And that was when I realized I didn't need their recognition anymore. Success, I thought, echoing an old phrase, is the sweetest revenge. The night of our billion-dollar celebration, I stood on the rooftop of our new headquarters, gazing out at the Austin skyline glittering like scattered diamonds. The wind whipped against my hair, carrying the sound of laughter from the floor below where my team was still toasting. My phone buzzed in my hand. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. 4 words, "We need your help." My heart sank. I didn't need to ask who it was. Their empire was crumbling, and they were coming for me again. Rumors started trickling through Houston like a slow leak. At first, they came as whispers at coffee shops, murmurs in boardrooms, and the occasional sharp comment on business forums. "Walker Co. is behind on payments," I overheard one former supplier say at a diner, his voice low but knowing. "Something's wrong." Another chimed in, "Contracts are falling apart. They can't keep up." I sat alone in my Austin office late one evening, scrolling through online articles and trade bulletins, my coffee cold beside me. The rumors lined up like dominoes, accounts frozen, lawsuits pending, suppliers refusing to deliver. Part of me wanted to be skeptical. After all, Walker Co. had been the giant in the room for decades. But another part of me, the daughter who had been erased, mocked, dismissed, was not surprised at all. My chest tightened, not with pity, but with recognition. This was inevitable. The arrogance that had once sat across from me at long dining tables was finally eating itself alive. I remembered a quote I had read once. "You can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality." Ayn Rand's words fit perfectly now. One afternoon, I couldn't resist. I drove back to Houston and parked across from the company headquarters. The building loomed, but its shine was gone. Workers on ladders were pulling down the massive Walker Co. logo from the top of the building. Each letter screeched as it was unbolted, the sound echoing through the street like a eulogy. The giant W swayed before it was lowered, leaving behind dark marks where it had clung stubbornly to the stone. A few employees stood outside, arms folded, their faces pale. I overheard their conversations. "They haven't paid us in weeks. My health insurance, gone, just like that. They kept promising things would turn around. Lies." All lies. Serafina's sleek car was still in the lot, but it was empty, its presence mocking what was left of her reign. I leaned against my car, watching the logo come down piece by piece. My breath left me slowly. "They erased me," I whispered, "and now the world erases them." It wasn't gloating. It was justice dressed in inevitability. The next morning, headlines screamed from every corner of Houston. Family empire collapses under mismanagement. Walker legacy in ruins. Photographs showed auctioneers preparing to liquidate assets, signs taped across the once glossy doors, closed until further notice. I sat at my kitchen counter in Austin, sipping coffee. The paper lay spread before me, Serafina's smiling face printed large from an old publicity shot, now paired with captions describing failure. My hands moved deliberately as I cut out the article with scissors and slipped it into a folder labeled Receipts. I had kept so many: emails, brochures, newspaper clippings. This one felt like the crown jewel. Ina walked in, pouring herself a glass of water. "Reading the morning obituaries?" she asked, glancing at the article. "Something like that," I said, tapping the paper. She shook her head. "What's done in the dark always comes to light." I nodded, quiet but resolute. Their fall was no accident. It was the direct harvest of seeds they had planted with arrogance and greed. Watching their empire unravel didn't bring me joy the way I once thought it might. It brought clarity. I thought back to the years of my father calling my career filth, my mother's careful words that masked favoritism as fairness, Serafina's smug glances when credit was stolen. They had built their house on a foundation of denial, and now it was crumbling under its own weight. I understood then. Revenge wasn't about screaming at them across a dinner table or demanding apologies they would never mean. Revenge was simply living long enough to see the tables turn. I poured another cup of coffee, the steam rising in the morning light, and whispered to myself, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." Marcus Aurelius had said that, and I felt it resonate deep in my bones. I had chosen a different path. They had chosen theirs. That night, as the city lights blinked outside my window, my phone buzzed. For a second, I thought it might be another news alert, but it wasn't. The message was short, desperate. "We need you. Please." I let it sit there, screen glowing in the dark, unread. My eyes turned back to the skyline, tall and bright, where my own company's logo now glowed. Their collapse wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of their desperation. The knock came just as I was wrapping up emails in my home office. It was late, too late for visitors, and the pounding was insistent, rattling through the quiet of my Austin townhouse. I froze halfway to the door, already knowing. The sound had weight. It wasn't a neighbor, it wasn't a friend. When I opened it a crack, the night air spilled in, carrying with it three figures I knew all too well. My parents stood in the porch light, worn and pale, their once proud faces etched with desperation. Behind them was Serafina, her posture stiff, eyes darting with a frantic energy I had never seen in her before. My father spoke first, his voice stripped of its booming authority. "Dimity, we need your help. The company can still be saved if you give us something, just a few millions to steady it." My mother clutched her pearls, her voice breaking. "Think of the family name, darling. Don't let it disappear. This isn't about us. It's about preserving who we are." I stepped into the doorway, blocking it with my body, arms folded. For the first time in years, the power shifted. They were on the outside, and I was inside. I let the silence sit heavy before answering. "The family name?" I repeated, my tone sharp. "You erased me years ago. You raised a glass to her while I sat invisible at the same table. You only remember me when you need money." Serafina scoffed, stepping forward. "Don't be dramatic, Dimity. You owe us. Everything you have, you owe this family." My voice hardened. "I owe you nothing. Not after years of being dismissed, humiliated, written out of history. Leave my doorstep before I call the police." My father's face twisted, rage cracking through his desperation. "We raised you, fed you. Without us, you'd be nothing." I leaned forward, my whisper cold and final. "Funny, I became everything the moment I left you." My mother's lips quivered. Please, Dimity, just this once. But I didn't move. The door stayed shut between us. Their pleas hit a wall they could no longer climb. Days later, my phone buzzed at 3 in the morning. I rolled over in bed, debating whether to decline, but curiosity got the better of me. It was my mother's number. Her voice trembled as soon as I answered. They're taking the house tomorrow, Dimity. It's all we have left. Please, just this once. Help us. For a long moment, I didn't respond. The silence pressed heavy through the line. I imagined her clinging to that house, the very one where my name had been erased from brochures, where my seat was placed near restrooms, where my sacrifices were swallowed into Serafina's praise, a house that had never truly welcomed me. I inhaled slowly and said softly, "Sell the house, save yourselves, but don't call me again." There was a small gasp on the other end. Then silence. The line went dead. I set the phone down beside me. I felt neither triumph nor regret, just emptiness. Sometimes the only way to win is not to play. I stayed awake after the call, sitting by the window with the city lights flickering across Austin's skyline. I thought of the garage nights, Ino beside me, coffee in hand, wires tangled across the table. I thought of the employees who now called me their leader, their family, not because of blood, but because of loyalty freely given. That was my inheritance. That was the legacy I had built. Their desperation wasn't proof of my cruelty. It was proof of their failure, proof that I had risen and they had fallen. I whispered into the quiet room, "Don't look back. You're not going that way." The words sat with me, not as comfort, but as direction. Just as I started to drift to sleep again, my phone lit up, not with a call this time, but with a notification. I unlocked it and stared. Serafina had posted a long tirade online. Her words painted me as the villain who abandoned her family, who let them sink when I could have saved them. Comments piled below the post. Strangers weighed in, some condemning me, others pitying her. The tide of judgment swirled around my name, people who knew nothing of the truth casting stones. Their desperation had turned to slander. And I knew then, I couldn't stay silent anymore. After Serafina's smear campaign online, I knew silence could no longer shield me. For years, I had convinced myself that ignoring them was strength, that my independence spoke louder than their lies. But watching strangers echo her words, calling me ungrateful and cold, I realized the truth. Silence had become a weapon they wielded against me. I spent evenings in my office gathering documents, financial records, proof of payments I had made, screenshots of every false story, contracts that carried my name, all the receipts of what I had endured. It wasn't about the money, it was about reclaiming the truth. My employees noticed my distraction and gathered around me one evening. "Dimity," one of them said gently, "you don't owe them anything. You've given enough." I looked up from the pile of papers and answered softly, "I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing it for me." The calm I felt was unsettling, like the quiet before a storm. I knew something was coming. It didn't take long. A week later, the pounding at my door returned. I opened it to see my parents, with Serafina standing defiantly behind them. The desperation in their eyes had soured into accusation. My father wasted no time. "Sign the check, Dimity. The family name must survive. If you care about us, you'll do it." I reached into the folder at my side and pulled out a check I had prepared days earlier. I held it up for them to see, then tore it down the middle with steady hands, the paper ripped clean, the sound sharp in the night air. "This," I said evenly, meeting my father's stunned gaze, "is the last check you'll ever see with my name on it." My mother gasped, clutching her chest. Serafina's face twisted with fury, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find words. "You can't light yourself on fire to keep others warm," I added, my voice like steel. "I've burned enough for this family." The silence that followed was thick. My father's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. "You'll regret this," he spat. I closed the door firmly, turning the lock with a final click. For the first time, I felt the finality of it settle inside me like a weight lifted. Weeks later, I was summoned to Houston for bankruptcy proceedings. I considered refusing, but something in me needed to witness it. The courthouse was stark, the marble floors echoing beneath every step. I walked into the room, my heels clicking against stone, and saw him, my father. He sat hunched, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn and pale. The booming voice that had once commanded rooms was gone. The judge read the verdict with steady authority. Assets seized, debts confirmed, bankruptcy filed. My father didn't look up. He lowered his head, his hands trembling on the table. For the briefest moment, his eyes lifted and met mine. There was no anger in them, no fire, only defeat. I felt no pity, only closure. I remembered a line I once read, "The mighty fall not by force, but by their own weight." It had never rung truer. Serafina sat beside him, her jaw tight, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother dabbed at her cheeks with a crumpled tissue, her pearls dull under the courthouse lights. I walked out when it was over, the sound of the gavel echoing behind me like the closing of a chapter that had begun long before. Outside, the Texas sun hit my face, and I breathed deeply. I thought of the years of humiliation, of empty promises, of stolen recognition, and I whispered, "This was never about money. It was about respect, and I earned mine without you." My father's collapse in that courtroom symbolized the final break. I no longer carried their judgment on my shoulders. It had crumbled and fallen back onto them. My strength wasn't reaction anymore. It was independence. That evening, back in Austin, my team gathered in the office. Laughter and warmth filled the room as they raised glasses, their faces glowing with loyalty and trust. This was my family now, the one I had chosen, the one that had chosen me in return. I raised my glass, but just as I was about to drink, my phone buzzed on the desk. One more message, one more unexpected plea. I set the glass down slowly, the noise of celebration fading into the background. One more request awaited me, this time, not from my father, but from someone I never expected. The sky was gray the day I drove past my childhood home. A line of trucks filled the long driveway where I used to ride my bike, movers carrying furniture out piece by piece. Auction staff stood at the entrance with clipboards, directing strangers who shuffled through rooms that once echoed with my footsteps. On the steps, my mother sat with her face buried in her hands, pearls glinting faintly through her fingers as she sobbed. My father stood beside her, hollow and silent, his once booming posture reduced to a bent frame staring at the ground. Serafina paced nearby, her phone pressed to her ear, her words frantic but useless. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the lawn, whispering, pointing. "The Walkers, can you believe it?" one woman muttered. "They were Houston's royalty. Now look at them." I stayed in my car, watching. My chest was steady, my grip firm on the steering wheel. Memories came uninvited, family banquets where my name was left unspoken, celebrations where my seat was hidden by the restroom, moments when my work and money were stolen only to crown Serafina. Now, the house itself was being erased, brick by brick. "They erased me from their story," I whispered, my voice quiet but sharp. "Today, their story erases them." I didn't get out. I sat in the car, headlights off, as movers pushed past my parents' pleas. My mother's cries carried faintly across the driveway. "Please, not that. Leave the dining set. It's been in the family for years." The man with the clipboard didn't flinch. "Ma'am, everything must go. Court order." I thought of every dollar they had demanded from me, every humiliation I had swallowed, every time they said family was about loyalty while practicing the opposite. This wasn't cruelty. This was consequence. I rolled down the window just enough to breathe in the sharp autumn air. "Play stupid games," I murmured. "Win stupid prizes." With one last look at the collapsing image of the Walkers, I started the engine and drove away. I didn't stop. Not for them. Not anymore. That night, I walked into my Austin headquarters, greeted by light and sound so different from Houston's silence. Balloons floated near the ceiling, banners hung across the lobby, "To our fearless leader." Employees lined up with wide smiles, clapping as I entered. Ino stepped forward with a glass raised high. "To Dimity," she said, her voice steady, proud. "To the woman who built what no one could take away." Cheers erupted, laughter bubbling through the crowd. Someone popped champagne, the cork hitting the ceiling before falling with a dull thud. Music played from a speaker, employees clinking glasses, hugging, celebrating. I looked around at faces that weren't tied to me by blood, but by belief, by choice. Their loyalty wasn't extracted through guilt or silence. It was offered freely, and it filled the room with warmth I hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt belonging without conditions. Family isn't always blood, I said as I lifted my own glass. It's the people who show up. The room roared in agreement. My chest swelled, not with pride, but with peace. Later in the evening, a photographer called us together. "One photo to mark the milestone," he said, ushering us into a group. We stood close, arms linked, faces lit with joy. The camera clicked, the flash bright against our tired but glowing expressions. A few days later, that photo was framed and hung in the lobby of our headquarters, right where clients, investors, and newcomers would see it first. I stood in front of it alone one morning, staring quietly. To anyone else, it was just a picture of a team. But to me, it was proof. The old family portrait that had erased me, cropped me out, dismissed me, was gone from my mind. In its place was this. "This," I whispered softly, "is the only family picture that matters." It wasn't nostalgia. It was closure. As the night wound down, I found myself on the rooftop of our headquarters, the Austin skyline glittering like a field of stars. Laughter drifted upward from the party below, muffled but steady. The air was crisp, filled with the promise of beginnings rather than endings. I looked out across the city, the weight of the past slipping away like shadows at dawn. My family had lost everything, consumed by arrogance and favoritism. But I had gained more than they could ever imagine. "I don't need their legacy," I said aloud to the night. "I built my own." And with those words, I closed the chapter. That was the end of their empire, and the beginning of mine.